just want to take a moment to acknowledge with gratitude that I'm hosting this meeting on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the Coast Salish peoples, the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. If anyone's joining from elsewhere, I invite you to enter that into the chat. But I'm very happy to be here today. It's a lovely sunny day here in Vancouver. Okie doke. So, oh, sorry, Amanda, I saw you came off mute. I don't know whether that was intentional or accidental. Or maybe by accident. Okay, I'll just continue on. So the agenda today, like I said, we're focusing a lot on the workflows for patients that might have to use the stabilization unit secure rooms, but essentially we'll just go through some of the standard introductions for these sessions, and then look at some of the core location build decisions that have been made. Specifically the one unit core location, we'll talk about the waiting room, the duplicate bed build for those secure rooms, and how that might look in terms of bed blocking, so that it is clear in the system if a bed is being occupied. And then we'll look at specifically those workflows and how that might look for folks in the clinical space. All right, so just the usual spiel here. I'll try to blitz through this because you've probably all heard this before, but essentially we're focusing on the Cerner-based build, which is really very New St. Paul's focus, what's tied to the success of opening day. We'll make sure that's in system. And then what is available today, we'll have that like-for-like scope available in Cerner when we move into the new site. And anything else that falls out of that scope will fall into the existing processes for any kind of Cerner request changes through our program informatics team. And we'll probably just blitz through introductions. I think most people have been here before. I think we have a couple of folks who weren't here before, but I can start and then we'll go left side down and then over to the right hand side for the clinical folks. So I am Susie Nguyen. I'm one of the clinical informatics managers supporting the New St. Paul's.
And I'm Susan Lin. I'm one of the CISs supporting New St. Paul's with Susie.
Hi, I'm Marissa. I'm the Senior PM supporting operational readiness for emergency and mental health.
Sarah Hooper, the Senior Clinical Operational Readiness Lead for mental health and emergent.
Claire is here.
There or
no, I don't see Claire. That's okay. Is Harinder here?
Don't think he's here either. So
no. Okay. Madeline?
Hey, I'm Madeline. I'm the manager of the Emergency and Urgent Care ECIS RDS team. Han?
Hi there, I'm Han. I'm the Clinical Systems Analyst for the Emergency Design team.
Oh, hi, I'm Vesna. I'm Systems Analyst for the Emergency Design team.
I don't think Katrina's here. Yeah, but Matt?
Hey, I'm Matt. I'm the Cerner consultant for acute care.
Matt.
Great, thank you. And then over to, I think Piot. Is Piot here?
Yeah, we can't hear you.
How about now?
Yes.
Great. Okay. Piot Migowski. I'm the program director for mental health.
Lovely, thank you. Grant? He was making a phone call. Sorry. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I'm back. Yeah, Grant Miller, psychiatrist, physician program director for mental health, and humbly got my ass kicked last night in hockey by Travis Feist, who I see is somewhere on this call.
Oh,
so we can put that in the minutes if you want.
Okay, he's gonna taunt you. Okay, Colin.
I look forward to hearing what the details. Okay, I am the PCM for acute mental health here at St. Paul's Hospital.
Sharon, I see your name.
Yeah.
Oh, hi.
Sorry, hi. Sharon Marmion, supporting clinical planning for the stabilization unit.
Simon? You're on mute.
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm division head, I guess, for PASU and ED psychiatry.
Sorry, do we have your title there wrong? We can correct that if it's incorrect. Okay.
I'm not really sure.
Okay.
Yeah,
Physician,
that's his title.
physician lead is the correct title.
Oh.
Physician lead. Okay, lovely. Thank you. Aaron.
Hi, I'm Aaron, the CNL for PASU.
Victoria.
Hi, I'm Victoria. I'm one of the mental health educators for program.
Hi, everyone. I'm Ashley Bolio, the other mental health educator.
Thank you. Mark here?
Don't see him.
No. Manny? No.
Mark is around. He's just doing a short day today, so he couldn't commit to the whole meeting. But if there's a question or anything, I can ask him.
Sure, thank you. I think Jacqueline was unable to make it today. Linda, are you here?
Okay. I don't see her either. So no.
Zoe.
Hi, Zoe. I'm Sue.
Travis, Pan, and ED.
Lisa, Pan, and ED.
Nice to see you.
Amanda, program director.
Jillian, one of the two St. Paul's emergency managers, and Virginia will not be joining for efficiency.
Okay, thank you. All right, is anyone here that is not listed? Just for minutes. Okay, lovely. Okay, oopsies, I went backwards. Okay, so housekeeping, pretty straightforward stuff when you're not speaking, just to avoid the background noise. You don't have to state your name before speaking. I think we can all see who's speaking when they do. Any non-urgent questions, feel free to add that to the chat, but I'm happy if folks just chime in, it's all good. And we are being recorded just for documentation purposes. And just quickly, we're here, phase one, we're focusing on things that are changing for in terms of workflows. And it's a planning exercise so that we have a better idea of what to build when we're in phase two come September, when we're building like for like, as well as the new and changing workflows. So again, we are focusing on this flow that may happen between ED and the stabilization unit. We want to really make sure that if and when the situation arises, that clinicians have what they need in Cerner for documentation and care. So specifically nursing and UCs, and also we'll aim to tease out some of these new workflows for the patients that are ED, that have to go to the stabilization unit, secure rooms, some of the more Cerner details for how they might access the chart, and then we'll look at the workflows for admission, discharge, and then the rare instance that they may have to go back to emerge. Any questions there right away? Okay. All right, so we'll look at some of the core location build decisions, and we have some questions as well. I have heard that we've decided to build the stabilization unit as one unit. So it'll be one 18-bed unit with one staffing model, the rationale here, but essentially to support oversight and then ease of placing patients in the one location versus two. And then I wanted to ask about the waiting room build. So we talked about this a little bit last time. There has been an ask for us to include this as part of the Cerner-based build. I just wanted to clarify the use case for this, because in current state for PASU, there's already 14 lounge beds that are built in Cerner, and typically the lounge beds are used for some like an alternative like place place patients should they need to kind of accommodate others, just so they don't get lost in the system. So the question is, knowing that we'll have the lounge beds built in Cerner in future state as well, do we need an additional waiting room or a lounge to built?
Sorry, I'm just not sure what you mean when it says current state PASU has 14 lounge beds.
So you have your I can't remember how many beds you have, like actual physical representations of the beds, and then in addition to those, there are 14.
There's one.
But sorry,
so
are we talking about are we talking about PASU at the current Burrard site, or are we talking about
Yes.
stabilization at the new site?
So we have 13 beds and one lounge for a total of 14 on the computer.
Oh, sorry, my mistake. I must be looking at the wrong domain, but in this build domain, it has 14. But sorry, that was my mistake. If there's only one lounge bed in prod, then we can either build up extra lounge beds in prod, or sorry, Sue, that was my mistake.
Oh, that's okay.
Or we can build up a separate waiting room space in addition to how many lounge beds you need.
So I guess there's two ways to go about it. We can have more lounge beds, or we could have the same, like one lounge bed and then the however many waiting room beds. But essentially, like, is there any difference in terms of use case that folks foresee? So I think just for ease, it would make sense for, like, from a Cerner perspective, just to have the lounge beds built and no additional like waiting room. But if there is a distinction in perhaps the flow or the use, then we're happy to do that. Just wanted to clarify. Yes, Pierre.
I suspect that our program doesn't have a lot of experience with waiting rooms across the acute program anyway. Can you tell us about the functionality of that in Cerner? Like, why might we want to have it built?
It would.
Maybe Emerge can answer that for us, because
so if you're going to use that waiting room as, like you're saying, a depot and go, the patient's going to go into that waiting room and the police are going to stand with them while we're organizing and getting everything figured out to give this person a depot and sign off, get the doctors to order it, and then we give it to them and then they go. Then are you going to be putting them in as through the emergency waiting room, or is it going to be like, I don't know where it is and exact from the emergency, right? Because if you're going to use it as a depot and go, it's going to be the emergency staff, like the PANs doing it probably. Or if they are someone that's settled that just needs to wait to see psychiatry to get their depot and go, that's going to be a different story. So there's two ways that can happen in Emerge.
I can see a couple of other use cases too. One example being if this patient has been on stabilization, admitted for 3 days, today is their day of discharge, they need to wait a little bit longer for, the AMCT nurse to come by to review the last thing, or someone else, or even transport. And, we have 14 patients admitted over in zone 4, and we want to move that person into stabilization ASAP. We could then relocate that original patient who's on their way out into the quote waiting area. And I think that there may be a need for some supplemental space as we're figuring out how we're doing the secure room dance, in terms of not always having the exact same number of stretchers available for the same number of people in the secure room area. To me, a lounge is more like where we would put an extra patient for an extended period, whereas the waiting room is meant to be really quite temporary. Whether we operationalize it on day one, I don't know, but I think we should move forward with a build. That's my take on it.
Okay, thank you. Amanda?
Not that I have any oversight, but I feel like you should build it, to Grant's point, for the just in case. Again, it could be a discharge, like consider it a discharge lounge, just sit and wait. I think it would be more appropriate to have it built versus after. Again, I don't necessarily think it might not be used day one for the first 6 months until you have a feel for it. And I get your point, Piot, like your team is not used to having waiting rooms, whereas we use waiting rooms unfortunately, as care spaces at times. So I think it is just having that ability as we move forward 6 months in of what we could use for that space and the abilities of that space.
Okay, thank you.
I think when we look at this, we have to decide is it going to be shared by mental health program and us? Like, so who's looking after those patients in there? That's the question I have from
mental health. But that like you're a year in, Travis. Hold back. You're a year into New St. Paul. Hold back.
I'm just excited. I get excited, right? So
yeah.
So then the other question is, like if the waiting room build meets the needs, are lounge spaces needed then, or like does it serve fundamentally the same need?
So that,
how many lounge beds do we need?
So that's the question. Like, if it's just a space to place a patient temporarily, then can a lounge bed, would that suffice? Or do you want a specific second lounge, or we call it a waiting room? We don't have to decide it today. We have a little bit of wiggle on this, but just wanted to see if there's a different use case, lounge versus waiting room, to, just to have the two different spaces.
I know Aaron's got his hand up, but can I ask a question related to this? Like, where do we even have room for a lounge bed in this area? And if it's somewhere other than the waiting room, is it not confusing to call waiting room patients lounge patients if the lounges are actually elsewhere?
Yeah, so I don't believe there will be any physical lounge. The lounge is usually just like a virtual space. Yeah, in case you have to, like, someone's waiting discharge perhaps, and you just move them into the lounge while someone else occupies that previous Cerner bed. So it's like a transition space and not usually an official, like physical, like a representation of a physical bed. Whereas, so here in this picture here, you'll have like the waiting room. I'm not sure how many chairs are there, so it's no like actual beds, but they would be beds in Cerner. So that could be, X amount of beds within the waiting room, in addition to a lounge if you want that, or we could just use the lounge and then just have that be the way to move patients in and out for a transitional space. Aaron?
Yeah, it sounds like we have I think it's a good idea to just build it in case we need it. It sounds like there's different ideas for that lounge that probably all wouldn't work together. Like there was another meeting where we talked about it as like a family visitor check-in arriving area, and then we talked about it, potentially as a depot and go down the road, or like an entry for a discharge lounge or PICU patients coming. Like I just don't think all of those things will necessarily all be able to be done at the same time there. Like when I think of depot and go, I wonder if that would be more appropriate, like in a quiet room, for example. And then you wouldn't have like a mental health nurse looking after like a patient that's not changed, for example, they're still in their street clothes. We don't know that they're safe to move to a quiet room if we had to. It seems more like an emergency thing to me.
Sharon?
I would vote for keeping the lounge bed and then creating specific waiting room beds, just because we don't know the functionality of that waiting room. And if we are going to use it as a care space, then we'll need to know who's there specifically, separate from the lounge.
Are you guys using the lounge very much right now? Like moving patients into that space in Cerner?
It's just for cleaning, really, like to kind of speed up the cleaning of a room. That's kind of the main reason we use it.
I see.
So we'll like virtually transfer the patient into the lounge to trigger the clean of the room they were in.
Okay.
Yeah.
Susan?
I'm just looking at prod right now, and I do see 14 lounge beds built out, which may or may not make a difference now that we've decided that we would like the extra waiting room build. I'm curious, like, it doesn't sound like you use them very much, but from what I can see, there are 14 lounge beds built out, which is actually a lot more than the usual standard for a unit build. Is that?
So you're saying PASU right now has 14 lounge beds?
Yeah, maybe I can share my, sorry, it's going to quickly share.
Oh yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so you see this here, this is PASU in prod. So these 14 here with the ones with the L. So those are like lounge beds. It's always with the L. And so there's kind of extra virtual beds. I know some units use it as like a place to put patients without LOA, so they don't hold up a room for them, or it's just a way to track patients so they're still in the system, even though they're not, may or may not be physically there. Or I understand PASU uses it for bed movement.
We don't use those. We use I've only ever seen one patient in the lounge, so I didn't even know that all of those beds existed.
Okay, because as it does not look like there are 14 lounge beds built out for PASU, but what I'm hearing is that we would like a separate, like a waiting room specifically designated as a waiting room space anyway. Is there a need for these 14 then? Like we can just build it like for same Pion.
It sounds like it hasn't been operationalized in current, so it sounds like it doesn't need to be built for future because it wasn't utilized.
I could see a couple, like, even 2 or 3, but not 14. I can't imagine why we would ever need 14.
It was surprising for me too, because usually the standard build is not 14 lounge beds, but in any case, maybe there was a use case for it, maybe as, I don't know, secure rooms or the census rooms. But if we were to build a waiting room space, would it be like one room with 4 beds, or I don't know how many chairs, but something, we don't have to decide that now, but something to consider in terms of how many wait room spaces you would need, whether it's built as separate rooms, whether it's built as one room with multiple beds or chairs.
I think it would just be one room. I don't know, we know yet how many chairs, beds, but it would just be in that one space.
Okay, so one room with X number of chairs kind of thing.
Yeah.
And then maybe like 4 lounge beds just for kicks.
4 is good.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Okay, sounds good. So lounge and waiting room, and we can, we don't have to decide how many like beds as chairs for that space just yet. Okay, cool. Anything else before I move on to the next? Okie doke. All right, so sorry about this. It's a bit of an eyesore, but this is, we're just shifting to the duplicate.
Oh, sorry, Susie, you have to share again. I
forgot.
Sorry. I took off your share. Sorry about that.
I just, thank you for the reminder. Okay, so sorry for this eyesore. A lot of Cerner beds. So this is reflective of what will be in system to support the duplicate bed build so that we can have that sharing of emerged patients in the physical stabilization unit secure room beds. So we've got the 8 physical beds that will be in the stabilization unit. You've got the 2 that will be in zone 4 in ED. So for these 8 beds on the mental health side for stabilization unit in the system, you will see, and these names and numbers will likely not be exact, but just for just demonstration, 1 through to 8. That will be STZ secure room, and then on the ED core location side, we might have to have just the prefix here, ED STZ 1 through to 8. So there will be an extra 8 beds in the system to allow for emerged patients into these beds in Cerner. So we'll go into this in a bit more detail. And then just to complicate things, we didn't add it on the screen here, but there will be the ED hold beds too, which is the same for every other bed space in ED to have like a second Cerner bed that is ED hold for the same location. So just to outline bed blocking. So the problem with...
Jillian has a question.
Oh, sorry, I missed that.
Susie.
Jillian, go ahead.
That's okay. My question is about the ED hold beds. Why would they need an ED hold bed if they would be admitted at that point in an inpatient location?
Yeah, so it would just happen automatically with the admit to order. So it'll flip to ED hold as per the usual. And then if the patient then has to move to, if they do have a bed available, which they would because they're already in it, then they would have to do the transfer. And then it would move from, say, it's not just pictured on here, but say room 1, and then admit to inpatient, flip to ED hold, and then when that patient can move to the equivalent in the mental health location, then you would choose this one, and then that would be your regular kind of transition. Does that make sense? Extra.
I mean,
yeah.
It's like they're already
Gillian.
in their admit bed.
So, Julian, the assumption is that this is an ED encounter in the secure room in a stabilization unit. So they haven't been admitted yet. I understand that might be a rare scenario where we're putting an actual ED encounter patient who hasn't been admitted yet into that secure room. But the assumption is that may happen. And so we're just planning for that, where this patient hasn't been admitted, so they're not an ED hold, but they're being placed in the stabilization and secure room as an ED encounter. And then
I thought ED hold was only for ED location with an admitted patient. But you're going to have
that's right.
Inpatient location with an admitted patient. So I don't think they'd need an ED hold.
So technically it's an ED location with an admitted patient. So it's going to be confusing. But
okay.
Yeah, it's an ED patient who's in an ED location, which is that red.
Yeah.
Those 8 red ones.
Okay.
So, yeah. So
but
this
physically
is
they're in the stabilization unit.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sounds
so there's the yeah, sorry, I wasn't very clear. There's the 8. Yeah. Yeah. Do you want to go ahead, Piotr? I think
Sorry,
or was it Aaron?
Yeah, I know we've talked about this in other venues, but any patient in the seclusion room on stabilization unit needs to have a bed somewhere if we're following the seclusion room guidelines. So that bed would need to be in emergency or on stabilization unit. All up until now, we've been told that we're going to be following that guideline. So if they're in our quiet room on stabilization, they should have a bed somewhere else, like physically a bed somewhere else.
We will support a bed somewhere, but I can't have an empty bed in my emergencies department just because somebody's in the stabilization quiet room.
Yeah, no, and I mean, Aaron, technically that is true, but we've got some workarounds that we'll figure out eventually how it lines up with Cerner, but I don't know if that's what today is meant to be.
Yeah, I think there's a deeper dive on that question, right? Because patients have to be able to go back somewhere. Like theoretically, the flow is that it's an emergency patient in that bed, and so theoretically they have to be able to go back to emergency. But how emergency wants to handle that's up to you guys.
Yeah, I mean, then we also have 4, like for example, 4 admitted patients on stabilization unit in quiet rooms that have no beds. They're essentially OCP patients that don't even have a bed. Like they couldn't be unlocked if we wanted to because they physically have nowhere to go.
Yeah, again, we'll figure that out, but that's not for the Cerner discussion today.
Yeah.
Why can't the stabilization unit build their platform on FirstNet? Because they can still go to PowerChart through it. And why can't that just go through FirstNet for all their beds? Is it because the mental health program can't go through FirstNet? It has to go through the PowerChart avenue?
Yeah.
Or what?
It's inpatient space versus emerge.
So all inpatient
ambulatory.
has to go through PowerChart. They can't have a FirstNet option on it? I don't know. My question, sorry.
Travis, FirstNet is controlled by your position. So it's like you have to be an emerge nurse to have access to FirstNet.
Well, I know that.
So oh, okay.
I'm just asking, why can't PASU, the mental health program PASU, be under FirstNet? Because they still can do all the same charting.
Travis,
and just have a different view.
I mean, we're talking about it as though it's going to be half and half, but I think really it's going to be an inpatient psychiatry unit with their volume.
Okay.
So we need to prioritize it for that.
Okay, I'm just throwing out because I just see like when I've worked in both places. I've worked in both computer systems and just emerge. We can go to the same place that you can go to in PowerChart through FirstNet. So I don't understand why we can't do that, but it's just weird.
My understanding is that these 8 beds will be built on FirstNet. right? Like we'll be able to see them on FirstNet, but they'll appear like ED beds. The 8 beds that are available for ED to use in stabilization will appear, but they also appear in inpatient.
Yeah.
They're a dual bed. So
Okay.
they'll appear on FirstNet.
It's just if you're a nurse working with PowerChart and FirstNet and you have to switch your position.
Emerge
to
will
go
not
with-
have to look at PowerChart.
Yeah.
These beds will appear in FirstNet. Yeah.
And they'll
I
have
hear you.
access
We can't
right
be.
to it.
Yeah, exactly. So it'll be
So
like
the
a
nurse
tab.
on stabilization will have to have PowerChart and FirstNet, just like we have an Emerge.
So it's kind of like the beds will appear in 2 different locations. So in mental health will work in PowerChart. FirstNet, it's kind of like currently in PASU, but our beds, it's like stabilization will be a tab. Like how ABSU is a tab currently, stabilization will be a tab, and the 8 beds that are available to ED will appear there.
Okay.
Yeah.
No, I understand through art. I'm just trying to think I'm trying to think as a nurse on the stabilization unit, how it's going to process in my brain how to deal with this charting. So I'm not thinking about abs the way I would do it now because I know how to do it now, but I'm trying to think about it as a nurse on the stabilization unit, how I'm going to access that. That's what I'm just trying to. That's what I'm trying to say. I'm trying to
I
think how
think
do we
we'll just
simplify
use
it.
this. We'll use Cerner to chart just like how we normally would, just on our regular mental health patients.
Yeah,
I think that's the least change because we're going to continue with the current state position. So mental health nurse, we'll use mental health nurse, and we just we'll be adding on what ED functionality is required for them to care for ED patients, because it would be a really big overhaul for them to all move over to an ED position, like an ED nurse position. There's a lot of operational training, work related to that wouldn't really make sense since this is an inpatient unit through and through, as opposed to an ED.
And that's why we're building 2 sets of beds, right? Like that's the whole point of this whole thing, is that so that we have PASU has the ability to view their patients through their system, and STZ, and Emerge has the ability to view their patients through their system.
You're on.
Yeah, that's
So
exactly right.
Sorry, how is that going to work then if I'm stabilization under PowerChart and there's a patient who is not admitted, who's in my secure room? How is that going to look?
So
and
if
how am
they're
I
an
going to
ED
see? How am I going to
patient,
see how I look after that patient?
so if they're an ED patient, we'll go into a deeper dive of the actual workflow of that. But basically, that ED patient, if they're an ED patient, they're going to be in an SPH ED STZ location. So they'll show up on Launch Point, Tracking Shell. On the mental health stabilized side, they'll use patient lists to pull that patient onto the care compass.
Oh, okay. So it's going to show up as a patient list the same way in FirstNet it shows up as, okay, gotcha.
Correct.
Thank you.
Correct.
Yeah, you just have to select this location, but you can essentially,
add them to their list.
do it the same way.
I mean, all the admit to psychiatry, like without the admit to psychiatry order in that scenario, like all of the admission tasks in Cerner, they wouldn't launch. I would think it would be fairly rare for a non-admitted patient to be in our quiet room, but yeah, we wouldn't be able to do like the mental health admission tasks, I don't think, without an admit to psychiatry order.
Correct. So once the patient gets bed transferred to one of the blue side, the SPH STZ SRM 01, for example, that's when those admission tasks would fire, because that's the inpatient location, versus when that patient's in an ED Cerner location, those admission tasks would not fire. So it would follow the usual admit to inpatient from ED workflow. They go to ED hold, and then once a census bed is available and held for the patient, and the patient gets bed transferred in system from the SPH ED STZ bed into the SPH STZ SRM bed, then those admission tasks would fire because they're no longer an ED patient in an ED location. So.
Is that clearer for everyone? Okay. All right, I'm just going to move on to the next slide to talk about bed blocking. So as you can see with the duplicated beds, it's going to be a little confusing. So there is a workflow that we've put together that can help folks find out in system if a bed is occupied or not. And there's a few different steps, so we'll go through it. And one of those is to block the beds. Not the best way. It's like it's a little bit, it's not completely intuitive, but bear with me. Let me just explain it first, and we can discuss afterwards. Because there are other ways that other ways to be able to find out who's where. So we'll just look at this side here on the left first. So let's say it is an inpatient mental health patient that requires a secure room. So because the rooms are being accessed by both programs, you can obviously like look in the room and see if there's someone in there. And you might also just know as well if there's inpatient mental health patients in there. But you can also look up in PowerChart using the patient location list to see if there is an ED patient in any of those rooms. The other thing that I think is the most important thing is a conversation between the flow coordinators. So the mental health side and the ED flow coordinators have a conversation around what the needs are, if there's any patients in the rooms or anyone that's expected to be placed in the room shortly. And then I guess an agreement of which secure room that will be used. You would then place the patient into the physical location. There'd be a bed transfer in the system to place the patient in one of those rooms, for example, the STZ secure room number 1. And then what you'd have to do to ensure that there isn't a patient placed in the corresponding ED space is to block this bed. So patient in the number 1 on the mental health side, and then for bed number 1 on the ED side, you would have to block that. So I'm going to pause there, and the opposite is true for an ED patient, but I'll just pause there first. Is there any questions before I go on to the other side? Okay, but essentially it's the same for the other side. So it's an ED patient who requires a secure room. You can look up in PowerChart. I know ED doesn't use PowerChart, but I think it'd be very quick to be able to do this, to have that list already created. You would just take a look and see if there's any patients in the space. And then you would also have a conversation with, Stillian, go ahead.
You can finish. I just have a thought.
Okay, no, I have a lot of thoughts too. Like, it's not the best, but I think like we said last time, like this is the best of the options that are possible. And this is a way to have communication in the system to know if there's a patient in the room or not. But yeah, so conversation, agreement, place the patient, assign the bed via launch point because it's ED, and then block the corresponding bed. So the patient is in the ED side, number 1, block the stabilization secure room number 1. And just to make matters a little bit more complicated, when the patient moves out, you have to do an unblock. So I know it's not the best, but to be able to see it in the system, this is a way to be able to do that. I know it's extra steps, not totally intuitive. I think what's most important, and is why it's highlighted here in red, is a conversation. So I'll pause there. Julian, do you want to go ahead and...
Okay, I feel like this speaks to what Travis was pointing out before. My first thought is, I'm backing you, Travis. My first thought is, I think we can look this up without going into PowerChart. We can have a patient list in FirstNet.
Yes, you can. Okay. Sorry, it shouldn't say PowerChart. Like in your FirstNet toolbar, there's a patient list button. You probably never use it because you're in the ED space,
but we'll learn to.
But it's there. It is there.
Yes. So my next question is there no way for these to somehow show up in FirstNet? Like, there's no way for an inpatient mental health patient to show up in those beds and us blocked it?
Because we had explored that option about because we wouldn't want the decision was we didn't want mental health inpatients showing up on FirstNet and in LaunchPoint and Tracking Shell, right? Because they're not ED patients.
I don't know. Like, I see that logic, but I also see the emerge nurse or PAN having to go to patient list to see if that bed is filled. Feels painful. So I don't know if there's a way for that to be clear that it's inpatient on the tracker and only to appear in the stabilization list.
Not with the way we've decided on the build.
Or is there a way to maybe have the two things happen simultaneously in the system? So if I'm putting somebody in the ED stabilization, ED secure room, it automatically blocks the bed on the other side?
That sounds too easy.
Yeah.
I don't think that's an option.
Which is usually a no.
Yeah. This is not that smart.
No.
When did we make a decision that we can't see inpatients on Cerner or on ED? Was that the last meeting?
That was the last meeting or the, well, it might have been an operations meeting. We sent out the slides, the deck for the decision for the duplicate bed build, and one of the options was either building all the secure rooms as part of the ED space or as part of the inpatient space. Neither were ideal. Like if you built it as part of the ED space, then for sure you would see the inpatients on the tracking shell. But it would mean a stabilization unit operating out of an ED space, even for their inpatients. And then if we had built the secure rooms as part of the inpatient space only, we couldn't, like as part of the ED launch point build, you couldn't easily pull those patients on the census because it's an inpatient location. It would be a completely new location tab. I don't know if that makes sense, but.
Something that came up in conversation, Vesna, maybe I'll call on you if you're there. We did talk about pulling the inpatient space like as a tab on launch point, but that would have to be a escalated design decision because currently it's all just ED locations. It wouldn't be smooth.
Having to click somewhere else is problematic.
So this is also clicking too. So be able to do that, you have to actually change your location. So it's I think it's five clicks.
No.
So it's 5 clicks versus how many clicks it is for. I think 5. I can't remember, but around abouts because you have to change your location. So out of ED to you'd have to change it to.
That's not an option.
SPH ED.
So there's no way to put stabilization as its own tab on FirstNet. That I can click over, look at the inpatient version of stabilization. That's not a design option?
No, because that's a different location. So it'd be the extra clicks to change location and then select
what
stabilization.
What about that previous decision around building them differently? Remember the 2 units versus 1? Because is this a vote for 2 units?
No, that was a different one. So that was just purely stabilization unit.
You might not like this comment, but I'm going to say it, Jillian and Travis. To both of you. We need to remember stabilization falls under mental health. So yes, we want access, but in essence of getting access to the beds, we have to work and we'll be like, just like PASU, we work for the bed coordinator. We may like, those are, I don't know how to say this, like their beds are beds. So like, what do we have control over? We have control over ED. Yes, we want reach in. Yes, we want to work to make sure we have access for patients to get secure locations, but it is going to be about working with the bed coordinator in stabilization and have that conversation. Like I know right now we can see PASU and you go through power chart, but I think we need to remember our reach is we need to call because we have an issue in ED and we need support, and then we work through the process.
I guess it's just knowing how often this will happen.
If you think there's going to be open beds and stabilization all the time, you guys are all crazy. Sorry,
well,
I probably actually
shouldn't say
that.
River of like an emerge patient can be over there. You know, I'm like, is this whole thing a heist? Like, this is never going to happen.
We need the ability to support patient care needs. If we think stabilization is not going to be full occupancy all the time, we're all dreaming. But we need the ability to perform and support a safe environment for patients in ED and the ability to have secure rooms. Like this is why we're building it.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I've been convinced. I think current design. What do you think, ABSU room? The 3 of you.
No, I mean I was just advocating because I thought it would if they were under. I thought it'd be no issue if they were under FirstNet, but I guess it has to. They have the mental health program has their way. The power charting is that way, and ours is this way. And I just was kind of advocating because FirstNet's really easy to use and to go to power chart. So I just didn't know. I was just pushing for that to be, maybe we reach that way, but if we can't do that, we can't do that. If that makes sense. Sorry. I'm just rambling.
Okay. Any other Thoughts, comments?
I mean, the worst case scenario with this entire endeavor here is that an individual is moved from the emerge side over to the stabilization unit, and oops, there's no longer a bed available to them in the secure room area. I don't think that scenario is very common. That would mean all 8 secure rooms are already occupied by somebody else, whether they're an emerge patient or a stabilization patient, right? So we just need to make sure that's the one scenario we don't let happen in real time. It might mean a couple of extra clicks just to make sure, but I think like 99.9% of the time, even if we forget to do the extra clicks, that worst case scenario is not going to pan out because there will always be an available secure room.
Or communication piece between the
Well,
two
the main
Communication piece should yeah, prevent that anyway. Yeah, you're right.
Well, for us to access those quiet rooms on the mental health unit, there's going to be tons of communication happening because we're going to have to organize it, and we're going to have to ask them how they're doing and what if they have a room available. There's going to be tons of communication. So if we're just looking at what we got right now, it's doable. You can see that there's access to the rooms because that's what we need to see as a panel. I need to see what you got there before you even take the time of day to go try to get it. Yeah, exactly. So as long as we can see it quickly on FirstNet, and if that's what the build is I see here, then it works on my end. I think on our end, because we're going to be communicating with the CNL and the bed coordinator that we need this bed of urgency, and we're going to make a plan together. So FirstNet will be, a quick look to see if it's there to even if I want to do that plan, right? Because with emerge, it's always go, 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 and I got to pick and choose what I'm going to fight for at that moment.
Jillian?
My one question is around if the secure room patient has a stretcher somewhere else in stabilization, will there be an ability for emerge to see that just because the secure room is open, that the patient's is technically occupied? To what Erin was saying, where it's like they actually have 2 locations?
I guess it depends on how you want to operationalize that. Like, because you can't place a patient in two beds. So how would you? What is I don't know if there's been thought around like how you would reserve the bed.
We've put lots of thought into it. No decisions. Is that something that needs to be decided today to move forward with this meeting, though?
No.
That's fair. I just was like for awareness for ED to be able to see it, but no, I don't think it's make or break.
I mean, the quick answer, Jillian, is I think we always have to have at least one stretcher somewhere within the stabilization available if we have 2 or more people in secure rooms. I don't think if we have 8 in secure rooms, we need 8 empty beds on the main unit because not all 8 are going to come out at the same time. So I think we can like shift chairs a little bit without, fully sinking the ship or breaking the law.
Okay, that makes sense.
And I think availability on the unit like really does have to go through the bed coordinator, like it does now, right? Like you can't just throw someone into the PASU without talking to the bed coordinator first. That really has to be cleared. So it'll be the same process.
And all of those seclusion rooms won't also actually be empty because we will have to have a certain number of seclusion rooms available for us if we need them unexpectedly. So like if we just unlocked 3 people that morning back onto the general unit, we can't fill those 3 seclusion rooms full of ED patients because our patients that we just unlocked could require that seclusion room again, and we need to have it available. So we can't fill up everything. We have to have some available rooms for us to use in an emergency as well.
So I think we all agree lots of work to be had, but I think in general principles, we have come to an agreement. Yes? Beauty. I see head shakes. I'm taking that.
So the bed blocking piece is just a recommendation for how you can have that clear in system. I think in red, that's the most important piece. Like there has to be a conversation. This, because it's not a very intuitive process, the blocking, unblocking, I imagine it will not be done consistently if it's done at all. So this is an option to move forward with in the future, but I think this is the most important piece. And then also you have your ability to check as well. And on the next slide, I can just quickly show folks how you could bed block using different parts of the system. So from the ED side, you can use launch point and then select out of service, and that will block the bed. Tracking shell, similar thing, out of service. And then for probably the mental health side, using PM office to go onto the bed board and then select out of service. Okay, but that's just to show that. And then the patient list, you would select those particular beds and then have that saved as a patient list, and you could always return there and check prior to moving forward with placing a patient in the secure room. Okay, any questions before we move on from the bed blocking piece? There'll be some other elements sprinkled into the workflows. Okay, I'm going to hand it over to Susan to go into the workflows.
Okay, thanks, Susie. So this next part of our discussion is about just going over our future state workflows for these ED patients in the stabilization unit secure rooms. I understand it'll likely not, or I shouldn't say likely, but unlikely for an ED patient to be in the secure rooms, but that's kind of the biggest change because if it's just an inpatient going or an admitted ED patient going to the secure room, then this just follows the usual kind of ED pathway, ED admit pathway. But we're talking about specifically more those ED patients in an ED encounter who needs to use a stabilization in a secure room and will be cared for by an MH program staff. So we'll talk about patient placement and flow, what the ongoing care looks like. Then ED disposition from those secure rooms. So whether they get admitted to stabilization unit, whether they get discharged from stabilization unit, whether they return to ED. And then that last piece is just about if they're coming from the usual ED path, it's just the usual workflow. So, okay, next slide, please, Susie. So key workflow changes is we kind of discussed it a little bit already, but just making sure that we check the secure room occupancy. So patient location, patient list in either first Cerner power chart, conversation with the flow coordinators on both sides. Then the whole blocking and unblocking piece is a new kind of workflow. We will be adding the some ED nurse tasking to both the MH nurse position and the inpatient unit clerk positions, so that when they're caring for these ED patients in an ED location, they'll be able to get the appropriate tasking, like the ED seclusion tasks and any consult tasks that they come from ED. And then what's new for the MH program nurses would be this ED depart process where they're completing this power form that's usually completed in the ED space, but basically all patients that depart from the ED, whether they're getting admitted or discharged from the ED space, have this power form completed. And then just the workflow for discharging and admitting them so that they actually do fall off the launch point and tracking shell in the ED side. And then we have ED patient discharge handout there as well as part of the ED discharge workflow, but I understand that's not usually provided in the ED space, but the MH program nurses will have access to that handout to complete for discharge. We can move on to next. So really super high level workflow for patients going from ED to the stabilization secure rooms. We've seen this in our last session, but basically, let's say ED patient needs a secure room. If they are medically stable and the zone 4 secure rooms are occupied, then it would be a discussion between the flow coordinator, CNLs, whoever else needs to be involved, where you would look to see if there are any bed moves in ED that can be made, or basically to see which patient can be placed in the stabilization unit. So perhaps maybe there's a patient in the ED space right now that is going to be admitted to stabilization. So that may be the most appropriate patient to move over to the stabilization unit, as opposed to this new ED patient who is requiring a secure room. So if bed moves can be made within the ED space, they would place that ED patient in that zone 4 secure room. Okay, otherwise, we would move the most appropriate patient from ED to the stabilization unit. Again, if it's going up, if it's a mental health inpatient who has just been admitted in the ED and is waiting for a bed, then it would follow the usual ED admission process to the stabilization unit. So the inpatient unit, so stabilization unit clerk or nurse would do a bed transfer from that ED hold to the SPH inpatient unit. And then that follows the usual inpatient care. Does that all make sense to everyone so far? That's kind of the same, I think. Now down to the middle part. So if it's an ED patient, again, who needs a secure room and is medically stable, that's being moved to stabilization unit, then that's when they would get assigned to that SPH ED STZ bed. So that's the duplicate bed on the ED side, and that would be done via launch point. It would be the MH program that staff are caring for this ED patient in that stabilization secure room. And then depending on who is, we can talk about, so the ED, the MRP may be ED, or if it's a psychiatrist has been consulted, then the psychiatrist may be the MRP who may discharge or admit the patient, of course. It'll be the MH nurse who's caring for this ED patient. It'll be the MH unit clerk caring for this patient. After hours, it would be the EDUC. Social work is to be determined, but in terms of a Cerner workflow, there's no changes to that. So just be more operationally who should be caring for these ED patients in the stabilization unit, likewise with allied. And then going further along, depending on the disposition of the patient, they either get transferred back to ED, which we understand is rare, or they'll get admitted to stabilization unit, or they'll get discharged. I'll pause there. Does anyone have any comments or questions about that kind of high-level workflow before we kind of dive into more detailed steps? Go ahead, Grant.
Thank you. This question is probably best answered by the PAN nurses. Recognizing in current state, it's likely quite rare for somebody in the secure room on ABSU to get moved back to the general ED. They are likely either going to get admitted to psychiatry or they're going to be discharged straight from the secure room area. Do we anticipate that being as rare in the new site when, this is going back to Aaron's point from earlier, when we're not really meant to keep somebody in a secure room any longer than actually required? They may still require a couple of hours of medical observation while we're waiting for, some level to come down a little bit more. So I'm wondering if that scenario of transferring back to the main ED might actually happen a bit more in the new site out of secure room. So I don't know, Travis, if you guys have any answer for that.
Well, I mean, the reason why we transfer out of a secure room is if the patient was going medically unstable, like say their pulse rate raised up, they're higher than 140, or they look delirious or something. So it does happen. We do, people get stuck in the quiet room, and then you do all your assessments, they get in there, and then they go sideways an hour later. So that's why when last meeting or a meeting I was at, we talked about how easy the access is back to the emerge site. Like it's a two-way street if someone was to go medically sideways. And plus, if they're in the PASU or the stabilization unit, they're still under the ER doctor. So I think we would access the ER doctor for those situations, and then we would make that decision to move them back. So it does happen though. But hoping that we have all the right, systems in place, that the people that we choose to go there are people that are actually going to stay there and either be admitted or discharged after they get a depot and their extended leave renewed, stuff like that, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or like a scenario that happened yesterday, trauma room patient came in high on crystal meth, got 25 and 2, sedated. He was very violent, moved to a quiet room, woke up 10 hours later, reassessed by ER doctor and discharged.
Amanda?
I think Travis gave some really great scenarios. I think it's also, Grant, like for me, even to picture, it's really difficult because we are building zone 4 to be like ABSU, but also recognizing we have our own constraints with zone 4. Like we have 2 seclusion rooms, we have 5 beds, much like current state, in front of us, in front of the care station, and 4 above. So I think we don't even we haven't had great conversations. Like we haven't sat down truly with our physicians in terms of like active use. So I know we're talking about moving back and forth, but I think we're considering out of seclusion into zone 4 as like that's one area to move someone out of seclusion room, but there's also move from zone 4 to zone 1, 2, and 3. So I think we still have to get an appreciation of that workload, physician coverage within the ED as well. Like we're trying to build same as current state ABSU zone 4, but there's still some constraints I don't think know the answers for. So I think there are multiple ways a patient's going to move. I agree. We don't want like a ping pong back and forth between stabilization and ED, but I also don't think we know until we're in there. Like, don't get me wrong, we're also going to have restraint patients in zone 1, 2, and 3. So it is going to be a very risk benefit conversation in the moment in terms of like who actually is required for the seclusion room and who's the most appropriate and what supports do we need. I don't know if that answered any questions or just added more confusion to everybody, but I think we're still working towards what it truly looks like in our new space as well. Not to cut, like Travis gave great examples, but I think we don't know what new will look like.
But I mean, we also do it very well, like rotating people in and out of the quiet rooms and from restraints to quiet rooms. I think with the fact that we're going down to only 2 quiet rooms in ABSU, not having 4, and there's going to be 8 on PASU. Now, stabilization unit is probably going to be full, and we're going to be having to figure out how to access those. And my question is if there's 18 patients on the stabilization unit, they're at census, and 4 of them are in quiet rooms, and those 4 in quiet rooms have an access to their bed on the unit, and there's 4 open quiet rooms, are we going to be able to use it to go over census a couple, or is it going to be only going into those rooms if you're at 16 or 15?
I'm just going to say that we don't have an answer to the exact numbers of it yet. But theoretically, yes, maybe, but like then also there needs to be that conversation of like, so when that person no longer needs a bed, and say that passive STZ flips to like all beds occupied on the unit, like where does that patient go? Like we don't want to keep that person unnecessarily long in that seclusion, right? So we do like, and I think for the purposes of building the Cerner build, like let's make all the moves possible. Let's make all the things possible, and we're gonna figure out the math on this as we go on thoughtfully. And we'll get an analyst to actually like do the math on like what the best kind of like balance would be. And then in reality, there's probably going to be a lot more conversation kind of in the moment with your bed coordinators, kind of trying to make the best decision in every given moment, right?
Mm-hmm.
And can I just say before we move on to the workflows in more detail, like we haven't got every iteration of possible clinical workflows. It's just kind of a higher level what steps would be taken in Cerner to support the different workflows. And for, I guess, the main patient flows through the unit. So not everything is captured, but I think what we've done is just been able to highlight the different changes for the mental health nurse workflow.
Thanks for that, Susie. Yes, recognizing that that's kind of the biggest piece that's going to change, because it is going to be the mental health nurse caring for these ED patients. So, okay, great. I think we can move on to the next slide. Just kind of a bit of a legend. The blue is kind of the same existing workflow steps, and any green going forward are kind of the new steps that are being added. So this first slide is just for like if a mental health inpatient needs that secure room, what the blocking and unblocking looks like. So going over to the far left, so the secure room is required for a mental health inpatient. We think I put question mark because I assume the mental health flow coordinator is the one that will determine which stabilization unit secure room to use. If there's no secure room available, there would be some bed moves to create a secure room. And then there would be a bed transfer of that patient from the current location to that the secure room bed, so the inpatient secure room bed.
That's all unit level stuff though. Like that's not
Yes.
bed flow coordinator. That's like charge
Oh,
nurse
okay.
and maybe CNL. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks for that, Aaron. I wasn't sure if that's why I don't know if the flow coordinator is involved in that particular step
Not
to determine. Not usually. Do you let them know that I'm putting an inpatient into the secure room, or is it just?
Yeah, we just update the bed coordinator throughout the day about the status of how many QRs we can make or are available. So if we unexpectedly lock somebody, we just tell the bed coordinator they now have like one less QR to work with.
Okay. Thank you for that. Okay. So eventually there would be a bed transfer of that patient from their current bed into the secure room bed.
Can I interrupt?
Yep, of course.
Can we go back? Can maybe some of the clinical folks, Aaron, if no secure room available and we're already working under the premise that we're not utilizing secure rooms unless we're using our least restraint policy, so they would need to be in there if they're in there. Where does this capacity to move people to create secure room space come from?
Well, it just gets tighter and tighter because right now we have 4 census QR beds, and we put the patients that are most likely, usually 48 hours, we'll keep those patients in there. Unlocked, and then we start to look for like another room for them. That's just kind of generally. So if we started to get lots of unexpected, like we have to have a certain number of quiet rooms reserved for the potential that recently unlocked patients will need to get relocked, or that patients that haven't even been locked at all might need to be relocked, or might need to be locked for the first time. Like we absolutely need to hang on to that capacity and like have available QRs for those people, because that happens all the time.
So I just think we should flag that this is still feels like a bit of an unknown for us.
Okay.
We also got to think about the new hospital, and that patients are going to have their own rooms. It's going to be a different environment. So we got to kind of see how it's going to work. You might not have, you're still going to have escalating patients, but some of them might be actually that used to escalate crazy on PASU, more subdued in their own space.
Well, the only thing is, Travis, on PASU, like most of our people do have their own space. We only have a shared in 151 and in 165, right? We are mostly singles and quiet rooms there.
Yeah, I guess so. I mean, don't they have TVs in their own rooms though?
That would be great.
They'll watch TV now. Hook them up to Netflix.
Sorry, and I don't raise it so that we can solve it today. I just think that this is a point in that flow that we just have to pin. There's still a big question mark around this. To Piot's point, I think we're going to try, if possible, to collect some data around secure room use to do some projections. It would be helpful to also do that on the ED side, I think, but yeah, just want to sort of put a pin there, but we can move on. Yeah.
Okay. Colin, I think you had a question.
I don't know, just a comment. Yeah, there's a lot of unknowns. I think, one of the other things, just to be proactive, we'll have to start thinking about how are we going to use 4 or 5 point restraints on people too, and how that's going to look. I suspect the guidelines for that will probably be changed by the time we move too, so that might have implications too. So it's great that they have single rooms, but it's going to be harder. It's also difficult to monitor, right? The way it looks like the rooms are laid out. So anyways, just a comment.
Thanks, Colin. So in system, if there is a secure room available and you're going to transfer, you would just bed transfer that patient to that the secure room location. The next step was assuming that there would be a 1-to-1 bed for each secure room, but I understand that's not really feasible, operationally feasible. So whether or not a census bed gets held for that one every patient is, I can understand, not going to happen. But if there is a census bed held, then that's just that step to hold that census bed. On
Sorry,
the block
just to
bed
clarify
block.
though, we're going to hold census beds for our own patients, right? Like,
right, yes, these are these are the mental
our
health
people
inpatients.
have to have beds on the unit still.
Would it be 1-to-1 for the mental health inpatients, or just one bed for
Well,
every? I think
because we can't go over census, right? Like we can't have 22 admitted patients to the
Mm.
stabilization unit. So all of our people in quiet room, if we're going to keep the same census, would have to have a bed.
Got it. Okay, so then this is true of
Again,
ED patients.
I'm repeating myself here. I don't know if we've confirmed that to be 100% yet, Aaron. There may be exceptions to that.
But we will staff for the surge, so that's a whole nother conversation. Let's save that for kind of like mainstream program planning versus this Cerner build day.
Okay, thanks everyone. Okay, great. So on the ED side, there would be a blocking of that duplicate ED bed, whether by the MH flow or maybe probably the ED flow, just for, again, visibility if you want to see that the bed is physically being occupied. And then the next two steps are just post-seclusion. So post-seclusion, you would then bed transfer that patient from that secure room into a census bed. And there would, whatever census bed is they're going into would be a held pop-up that comes up, but you can just override it. And then they can transfer that patient there. And then there would be an unblocking of that, the duplicate ED bed as well, once that patient vacates the room. Okay, so that's for the mental health inpatients that are needing the secure room. Our next slide is for the ED patients. This one's a little bit busier. They're broken up into little kind of squares because the last three parts are more the ED dispositions, which we'll go into further detail later on. So if there's an ED patient needing that bed, and again, this is an ED patient in an ED encounter, as opposed to an ED patient who has been in an ED hold that has been admitted on the ED side that's coming into the stabilization unit side of things. So a stabilization unit secure room is required for an ED patient in an ED encounter. There will be that discussion, and the MH flow coordinator determine which secure room on the stabilization unit to use. An ED nurse or the ED flow would assign that patient in Cerner on launch point to the SPH ED STZ01 bed, for example. And then the MH flow would go ahead and block the corresponding inpatient bed. They would use PM office bed board. And then there would resume the care of the ED patient by the MH staff. So MH nursing, MH clerk. I'll pause there. Any questions about that first piece before we move on to the ED dispo bed blocking workflow or high level workflow? Sarah?
I'm not sure if this question is related to this or not, but I'm curious what triggers housekeeping to clean a bed, and are there any considerations for the cleaning process, whether it's a bed coming from ED, a secure room coming from the ED bed list, or the mental health? Because I don't know, is there any considerations for that process here for bed cleaning?
I can see possibly, because I think it's a dirty status that would probably, so when a patient moves. So I don't think the blocking, unblocking piece, but probably when a patient moves from the SPH ED SR stabilization bed, and you move them into the inpatient bed, then that SPH bed would be marked as dirty. I don't know if that, does that actually trigger cleaning from the housekeeping side? I believe it does.
I think so, when they're vacated from the space. So I think the only instance where there might be confusion is if it's the same physical bed and they just move from an ED encounter, ED hold briefly, and then inpatient location, then housekeeping will probably show up and the patient's in there. So yeah, that's a good point, Sarah. But I think it has to be like all the stars have to align for that to which might happen if the patient is in the secure room as an ED encounter and then is admitted and then stays in that secure room as an inpatient. So in which case, I think there's no way to not have that flag. I think it would just be communication. I can't think of any other way. But let us take it away and maybe look into it a bit more.
Thanks, Sarah. Okay, moving on to the ED disposition. So from that point, there'll eventually be a decision to either admit that patient, discharge that patient, or return to ED. So if they were to be admitted, that SPH ED, once the admit to inpatient order is entered by the psychiatrist, the SPH ED STZ01 bed would flip to the corresponding hold bed. And then at some point, if there is capacity on the stabilization unit to take on that patient, when that happens, then again, I put that census bed up to held, but again, I understand. I'll just skip that step because I understand that may or may not happen one-to-one. Eventually, there'll be an inpatient bed transfer from that held ED hold bed into the SPH STZ SRM01 bed. And because that bed was previously blocked, there will just be a pop-up when the clerk or the MH nurse does that bed transfer. And there's no need to unblock it first before doing the bed transfer. You just override that pop-up and then place that patient into that inpatient bed. So just a bed transfer within system, but the patient staying possibly in that same room physically. Okay. And then going down, if the patient is to return to ED, then there will be that discussion between the two, between the staff, and then there would be an ED staff who would assign that patient into another ED bed, perhaps a zone 4 bed or some other bed via launch point or tracking shell. And then the ED would resume care of that patient, and then the MH flow would go ahead and unblock that inpatient bed as well via the PM office bed board. Okay, and then the last flow would be if that patient gets discharged from that stabilization unit secure room, the MH staff would go ahead and discharge that patient from SPH ED STZ01, and then complete their discharge documentation for ED, and then the MH flow will go ahead and unblock that bed as well. Any questions on this kind of more high-level workflow before we go into the next slides are much more detailed, going into kind of the step-by-step. We just wanted to highlight kind of the new steps, mostly that the MH nurse would have to be taking on because they're caring for these ED patients in an ED space now. Right. Okay. Apologize, very busy slide for the next one. So starting at the top and kind of looping around. So in this case, we have a decision to use the stabilization secure room for an ED patient who is in an ED encounter. The patient would be assigned via launch point or tracking shell to the SPH ED stabilization 01 bed. And these are the various positions that can perform that step, but likely I think it'll be like an ED nurse or a PAN or ED flow. The MH flow coordinator will go ahead and block the duplicate inpatient bed via PM office bed board, or it can be the MH nurse if they're covering, or also the MH clerk. That's again kind of a new step. The ED nurse or PAN would escort that patient from ED to stabilization unit along with security. The ED nurse and / or PAN would provide the verbal handover to the mental health nurse. At some point, the MRP, so whether this is an ED provider or a psychiatrist, would enter that ED seclusion adult module because this is an ED patient still. Okay. The MH nurse would go ahead and add that ED patient from their patient list to their care compass. And then they would receive those ED seclusion tasks via care compass. And then the MH nurse will go ahead and document their seclusion initiation, same way as they do current state, via care compass task, and then I'll lead them to iView and the TBD view. And then just some system steps. In tracking shell, the ED clerks will see the seclusion orders in both of the unit clerk tabs under the activities column as a green cross. It's not a task, but it will just be, they'll just see those orders. But they just ignore it because it's nothing they need to do. From launch point, they will, for that patient, because they're still an ED patient in an ED location, you will be able to see the seclusion orders and tasks for that patient in launch point. But because it's not an ED nurse caring for the patient at this point in time, it'll just be the MH nurses kind of or acting on those tasks. So the MH nurse will go ahead and document their usual seclusion care, safety and attendance, IVU, a nursing narrative note as needed. They would go ahead and provide ongoing seclusion room care of the ED patient, and then until there's a decision to either admit, discharge, or return to ED. So that was a lot. Any comments or questions about this kind of initial workflow for the MH nurse? Grant?
Thanks. Sort of a question for Simon, I suppose. How often would the psychiatrist be ordering emergency seclusion orders for an emergency patient that is not admitted under psychiatry? I don't think I've ever done it on call. Simon, do you guys ever do that during the day? I've only ever ordered seclusion once they are admitted under us.
Yeah, nope, only once they're admitted.
So then usually it would just be the ED provider then who's doing this, entering the ED seclusion orders. Okay, thank you for that. Yeah, okay.
Yeah, so especially on the ED side, the PAN would be engaging with the ER doctor and be getting those orders in so that the person, if he was going to access it in that other area, in the stabilization unit too.
Okay, thank you. Any other comments about this workflow? That. Okay, great. So hearing none, we're going to move on to the next few slides are about admission, discharge, and then return to ED. So this one, sorry, the busiest slide of all. This is for those, again, scenario where the patient, an ED patient in that ED encounter is in that stabilization secure room. And then at that point, there's a decision to admit this patient. Okay, so at this point, the decision to admit is made by the psychiatrist. So they'll enter the admit to inpatient order on the ED encounter. In system, the ED encounter flips to an inpatient encounter. The ED location updates to ED hold. So for example, SPH ED STZ01 will go to SPH ED hold STZ01. That also in system will trigger a bed transfer request task that will appear on the multi-patient task list for the MH flow coordinator. To note, the MH nurse would and the clerk would also see these the bed transfer request task, but unless the MH nurse is covering, it's just they just see the task, but they don't actually act on it because the mental health flow coordinator will be the one who completes the task. The patient does appear on the CCC CAPEX under expected because it is an admission. The MH flow investigates bed availability. So, i.e., is there a census bed available on stabilization unit for post seclusion? So at this point, it's basically if the stabilization can take that patient on right now. And if not, they just kind of stay in that ED hold location until they take the patient as an inpatient. So again, this is happy path. So we're assuming that they're able to take the patient at this point in time. Again, this is about the census bed, but MH flow places a hold on a census bed on the inpatient unit via bedboard. The MH flow coordinator will go ahead and complete that bed transfer request on the multi-patient task list once inpatient placement is confirmed. Again, or if the MH nurse is covering, he or she would do that via Care Compass or single patient task list. Just in system on the ED tracking shell, once that admit to inpatient order is entered, there are some clues that the patient is being admitted. So they'll get the admit, the blue arrow and the red dot indicating that the patient is being admitted. So the patient will also appear in that admit to floor SPH filter for on the tracking shell. This next box is the ED registration clerk who does their encounter updating. So the patient, like all ED patients who get admitted, will fall on that tracking shell, and the reg clerk will go ahead and complete the conversation. Launch point also, the status column will update with that admit status. So you get that bed icon on the launch point to indicate this patient is now admitted. Next one is a new step because instead of the ED nurse, it'll be the MH nurse who has to complete that ED disposition documentation power form. And they have access to it via ad hoc, or we'll be requesting to add the ED discharge admit workflow tab. It is an EDD, so ideally they do get access to that workflow tab just because it streamlines their documentation and the workflow so that it aligns with the ED nurse. So they'll complete that power form. When the patient is ready, like this is just in system transfer because patients potentially not moving rooms physically, the clerk will go ahead and complete that bed transfer from the ED hold location to the SPH STZ SRM 01 bed, so the equivalent inpatient bed. There would be a pop-up because that bed was previously blocked as out of service. They can just go ahead and override that pop-up, click yes, and then bed transfer that patient in. So no need to unblock the bed. And then after hours, it can either be the ED clerk or most likely probably the MH nurse doing that bed transfer step. Okay. Any questions before I move on? I just kind of pause there first because I know there's a lot. Okay. Okay, next step, the MH clerk will complete the ED admit conversation from the ED discharge admit workflow tab. And that's kind of what causes the patient to fall off of ED launch point tracking shell. In the ED space, it's always the ED clerk who completes the ED admit conversation. So just kind of aligning the two workflows. So after hours, if the MH clerk is not there and this is happening, then there would have to be a conversation or a verbal phone call to the ED clerk that the patient has been bed transferred to their inpatient bed. So then the ED clerk would go ahead and complete that ED admit conversation from the workflow tab. And that again would cause that patient to fall off of the first net census. And then next step, we would have that bed blocking of that corresponding ED bed because that patient is now in the other Cerner bed, but physically in the same bed. So that bed blocking would occur. And then because this patient has now been transferred to that inpatient bed, he or she would now receive those mental health admission tasks on their care compass. And then they would provide ongoing inpatient care. And then once that patient is moved out of that seclusion bed, there would be someone would have to unblock the SPH ED corresponding bed, either in launch point tracking shell or it could be in PM office as well. Okay, so this is a very hairy workflow because there's a lot of new steps and new things, but I'll pause there for any comments, questions. No questions? Clear as mud? Really? I can move on? Do it. Maybe give people a few minutes to, I don't know. Okay. Okay. We can always come back if there's no questions and we'll move on to the next workflow. A little bit simpler. So this is again an ED patient who is being discharged from the stabilization and secure room. So they're in an ED encounter. Okay. So at this point, either the ED provider or the psychiatrist, so it depends on whether the psychiatrist has been consulted, they would enter a discharge patient order on the ED encounter. Some system things in launch point. The status column would update with a discharge icon. Tracking shell would also display an icon indicating discharge. From the MH nurse side, he or she would see that discharge patient order on their care compass. So it's just a new order alert. It's not a task. So the next few steps are kind of ED related documentation. So the MH nurse would complete again that ED disposition documentation power form, again accessed via ad hoc or the new workflow tab. That power form is completed for all patients who are leaving the ED space. So they go ahead and complete that power form. If required, they can complete that ED patient discharge handout and print one for the patient. Again, it's currently not done in the ED space usually, but they will have access. They do have access to that note type if they need to. Patient physically leaves the hospital. At this point, there needs to be someone who discharges that encounter. So either the MH nurse or the MH clerk can complete that discharge encounter conversation from the ED discharge and MIT workflow tab. Really important that it's not done from PM conversation, which is their usual access point for this conversation. Just because if it's done, the patient doesn't actually fall off launch point or tracking shell. So ideally, they completed everything from that workflow tab, the documentation and then discharge. There's a hyperlink directly to the discharge encounter conversation. And then the MH nurse will go ahead and remove that patient from Care Compass because the patient is no longer there. And then the nurse or the flow coordinator will go ahead and unblock the SPH, STZ, the inpatient room that was blocked because of an ED patient in that bed. I'll pause there. Any comments or concerns about this workflow?
At somewhere down the line, I guess closer to when we're in there, like they'll just distribute this to the nurses or whatever, because the nurses would usually discharge out of the PM conversation. So, I guess we'll just tell them not to do that.
Yeah, if they do, the patients get stuck on launch point, but there's a way to remove them. It's just that ideally they get discharged from that workflow tab.
I'm sure someone will educate them about that closer to the date, I guess. Yeah.
And then again, this is just for those ED patients in an ED encounter. So.
And just to add, there will be training and education materials and things like that closer to. Right now, this is just a bit of an overview of how it might look. Of course, it's not, you don't need to remember everything right now. It's just kind of to outline how it might look in the future. And then we'll have the proper training and education materials later on. Jillian?
My only question is around the disposition documentation and how it pops up for a mental health nurse, because I know we're just used to seeing that on launch point.
Does come as a task, Jillian? Because
do people know? How do we know to do the disposition documentation?
Because if there's a task associated with it, then we would give that task to the MH nurse as well and make sure it appears. But I actually don't know. Forgive me.
I'm going to call on the ABSU group.
No, it doesn't. There's no task. You have to go into the patient. What is it?
The workflow and actually.
Yeah, the patient summary, and then go into the discharge and click on it there.
Yeah, it's in the chart. It's not a task.
Okay. I think it might just be because we'll be requesting to add that workflow tab, the ED discharge and admit workflow tab. So I think when an MH nurse is discharging or admitting a patient, they just work off of that workflow tab. So that's where they'll do their power from documentation, discharge the encounter, doing the ED admit conversation if they want to, kind of a one-stop shop for all those ED patients. Pia?
Thanks. There's a few things that I'm not really familiar with on this that might make this question a stupid question, so treat it that way if it is. If a patient is being, even an ED kind of mental health primary patient who's not admitted is sitting in one of these passive environments and the nurse is discharging them home. They're not going back to the ED, they're just going home. Do the discharge tasks, does it actually make better sense for the discharge tasks to be like mental health discharge tasks, like what would normally be from an inpatient unit, or is there a benefit to being the task set that's ED? And I actually don't know what they are, so that's part of my ignorance on that. I don't know.
Our assumption is because they're ED patients, we just follow the same ED tasking as opposed to inpatient tasking for these patients, but please, anyone.
I don't know. I'm equally uneducated about this, but I do know Teresa's not here today. And Piat, just for your awareness, she was on the last meeting and indicated that for the ED patients, it might make the most sense for the social work ED to continue to follow up, just because they'll be working with the ED physician and they'll be knowledgeable about some of the resources that they utilize for ED discharges.
Right. So then the task list makes sense to
maybe,
to
yeah.
stay there. Yeah. Okay. All right. Thank you.
Thank you for that. Any other comments or questions? Okay. Then our last workflow slide is related to a patient having to return to ED. So again, I understand this is rare, but for example, if a patient becomes medically unstable while they're in that stabilization unit secure room, or they could come out of seclusion and there hasn't been a decision to admit or discharge, which again, I believe that's a rare scenario. But if this does happen where there is a need for that patient, ED patient, to return to ED proper, then the ED flow will determine which ED bed to assign the patient. So maybe zone 4 or any other zone. Either the ED nurse or the PAN or the ED flow, likely those positions, would assign that patient from their SPH ED STZ 01 bed to another ED bed. And that's just done via launch point. The MH nurse and security would go ahead and escort the patient back to ED from the stabilization unit. There would be a verbal handover from the nurse to nurse. The MH nurse would go ahead and remove that patient from Care Compass, and then it'll just be ongoing ED care by the ED staff, kind of as per usual. And then there would have to be an unblocking of that the inpatient bed via PM office now that that secure room has been vacated. Any comments or questions about this one? And does that, any comments or questions about anything in general from anyone? Oh, Pia?
Particularly on this detailed flow stuff, like I never worked frontline with Cerner, so a lot of this is really hard for me to process. So I hope that there's other people on the call that a lot of this just like makes like total sense to, which is I can see folks are listening, so that's good. It does raise like just along what Erin was saying earlier, like I do get the sense that there's going to be a like the rollout of these workflows is going to be fairly intensive, and I can imagine that there's going to be some of the workflows that, depending on what we decide, kind of, you know, in some of those pins that we've put throughout this conversation, that they're flows that are going to happen very often, and we're going to be like, wait, who enters what in this situation? So it's like there needs to be like a rollout around kind of what are the day-to-day kind of workflows, but then also a rollout around like what are the ones that we don't do very frequently that we need to like be able to look up, and there needs to be like a manual somewhere that like we figure out how, so that there's actually like that rollout is going to be really, really complex. And I agree, Erin, that we really need to, we're going to need to put a lot of effort into that that part of the transition.
Especially since it does sound like it's most likely going to be more admitted patients who are coming over to stabilization, but this work is all about patients who are in an ED encounter coming over to that space. And so maybe it's more rare that this happens, but we're just making sure that in system, the MH program staff have what they need to care for these ED patients who are technically in an ED Cerner location. So.
And we have an opportunity, like when we actually do the build, to revisit all this stuff. So we have some time to think about things. to really fine tune. But yeah, definitely like the rollout, the education, like really important. And similar to what we have current state with CST Cerner Help, there's like workflows that you can look up as well for things that maybe don't happen very often, and there'll be a step-by-step of how to kind of address the functionality. So yeah, that's a later thing to do, but for sure it's on the radar.
Great. Okay. Our next slide is just about, again, just kind of going back to this bed blocking. We're hoping that it makes a little bit more sense now that we've kind of walked through the different scenarios and what that looks like. Again, this bed blocking, it is a manual process and it is quite cumbersome, but it's kind of the only way to really see which beds are occupied in the system. Again, that conversation is really key, and just looking at that location patient list is probably more the accurate measure for seeing which room is available or not available. We don't have a slide, but they're just the workflow for the usual ED admit workflow for a patient coming from an ED space into stabilization unit. So if they're in an ED hold, there's no change to that workflow future state, but the only piece would just begin that bed blocking piece. So if it is, it would just kind of follow that inpatient flow where an inpatient mental health patient is occupying the secure room, and then that ED duplicate bed will have to be blocked correspondingly. But otherwise, we don't anticipate any changes to the usual ED admission workflow. Grant?
I apologize if this was discussed and I missed it as I was dealing with something upstairs, but I know we're talking mostly about the secure rooms today, but in theory as well, there could be an ED patient that is occupying a general stabilization unit bed. And by ED patient, I mean they're under the care of the emergency department physician, may or may not be referred to psychiatry. But they're going to be on the stabilization unit in a bed there if we actually have availability. Does that influence anything in terms of Cerner build?
So we haven't accounted for that in terms of the bed build, because our understanding is that it would just be the secure rooms that are being shared. Not to say that, I know we did have some initial conversations of this being the future state case where there could be ED patients in one of the census beds. Is that something that we need to explore now in terms of building those beds out, or?
I mean, it's not likely an issue right away. When I look back over our last 2 years of stats, I don't think there would have been a single day where one of those beds would have been available to an ED patient. But again, if we actually continue making advances with our flow strategies in other areas, that is the dream, that one day stabilization will have, let's call them empty beds, that the ED mental health patient can move into instead of staying over in acute zone 4. But anyway, Jillian, you look like you had something to say.
I just wasn't sure if I was following. Were you kind of saying like a patient who comes in, needs a QR, gets sent over to stabilization, but then when they wake up, they don't actually need to see psychiatry? Is that what you were saying?
No, I'm not saying anything about a QR. I'm probably saying the opposite. They don't need a secure room. But the stabilization unit has empty beds because that's what it was originally designed to be, was a kind of an assessment area as well for patients that come in, have a history of mental health or substance use concerns, are being managed by the ERP, might get referred to psychiatry, might not get referred to psychiatry, but because there's availability on the stabilization side, that's where all their care is happening. That was the original dream, as I understand.
Yeah.
I'm gonna I was looking for like a GIF to put in the chat that's like the can of worms is open, the worms are everywhere. Thank you, Grant. I think that it's I do think like that was the original plan, but I think that given how it looks like, I think that it's like a whole bunch of additional work to plan that, not only from the Cerner perspective, but like from a programming perspective, right? Like to be able to care for ED patients in the main space is a whole heck of a lot of work. And there's no reason to think that we will be able to actualize any capacity out of that like anytime soon. So I think it probably makes sense to put on the shelf for now.
I think for the future, if that's something that folks want to do, we'd have to maybe just expand what the scope for like the duplicate beds. So adding regular beds and duplicating them. Sorry, adding duplicate beds that are not secure room to the ED like location, I think would be the best way to do it, following this model, which obviously is not clean. But I think unless this is something that we anticipate for like opening day or thereabouts, perhaps we wait to see how this goes. But that's your call as well, like the program, if that's something that is desired.
I mean, Amanda's jumped off. We probably need her to weigh in on it. I think Piot and I can quite happily say we're fine with this general stabilization unit beds just being mental health. But Amanda may or may not take issue with that for day one. I don't know. But yeah, I agree. Pragmatically, I mean, they're going to be full with admitted inpatients to mental health.
Yeah, and emergency has 25% new care spaces, right? So given those two facts, it's pretty unlikely that push is going to really be a reality for a bit.
All right. Anything else before we wrap up? Sorry, my table just broke.
Maybe I'll just say thanks everyone. This is like grueling. I wasn't here last time. I heard it was also really grueling. This is a lot of heavy work, and it's just the start. There's 2 more years of this. So I just want to thank everybody for your commitment. Like I see a lot of passion around for everybody, that everybody really cares about their work and their patients, and that's great. That's what makes this place a good place to work. And thank you for your very hard work on this.
Thanks, Pierre. I was going to say the same thing. It's been really impressive actually to see everyone's engagement. It really shows that people care. And although it makes it a more complicated session to facilitate, I think it's great. So I have one more slide just for like next steps. And essentially we have we've done the current state overview. We've done like one design. This is the second design that we've done. There is more to come to kind of wrap up all this like new workflows piece. We will have a session with probably, I'm not sure if it's 1 or 2 sessions with the mental health nurses and also ED to look at the tasking to have included for the mental health nurses caring for the ED patients. So that is coming. We're still organizing the date for that. But the other pieces that we're taking away, we still have not submitted that sustainment ticket around the handover, but that will be done shortly. This is the small working group I was referring to for this March meeting or meetings. We have logged some escalated design decisions in relation to the duplicate bed build, just to make sure that's approved. And then the next piece is the tasking for nursing and UC, which is related to this one. And I will send a wrap-up email to the program directors, kind of summarizing the sessions, what we've discussed, decisions made, and then just a link for all the tickets that have been logged. And then that will be all for phase 1, and then we'll do some we'll link back to folks in a different way. Won't be sessions like this in, I think, the summertime to look at some of the bed mapping, and then we'll have some sessions for phase 2 of our Cerner based build, which looks at the actual like build and all that kind of jazz. So and we'll be able to loop back to this stuff here that we've covered, just to make sure we're all good for building. And that is all. Any final questions before we finish up? Okay, lovely. All right, well, thank you very much. Giving back 8 minutes. I hope everyone has a wonderful rest of the Friday and a lovely weekend. Again, thank you very much for your engagement. It's been lovely to work with everyone.
Thanks so much.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you. Bye.